Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 221. This is for Shakespeare for Wednesday, the 10th of March. Where we are is in Much Ado About Nothing, and we saw a production with Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson. One of the reasons why I wanted you to see that production is so that you could see a kind of Hollywood spectacle. Obviously, it's a very different kind of interpretation than what we saw on stage, but one of the things I can say about this particular performance is that I actually saw it when it played in movie theaters, and the movie theaters were packed, mostly with very young audience members. So Kenneth Branagh, who played both the lead role in Benedict and also directed the movie, was able to make Shakespeare accessible and popular to the masses. And if we think about Shakespeare's goal was to make his plays accessible and popular to the masses. So I'd like to think that Shakespeare, at least the businessman, would approve of that interpretation. That's not to say that there aren't flaws within the film that we saw. I think the difficulty when you are your own director, as well as acting, is that you don't necessarily have an outside voice to tell you to rein it in a little bit. And I know that scene, at least for me personally, when I see Benedict and Beatrice both expressing their joy that the other loves them, and Benedict is jumping up and down in the fountain, seems to be somewhat excessive to me, and Beatrice is on a swing. And I've already shared with you that I think that Keanu Reeves is miscast. I don't think he's a particularly good Don John, but it makes sense to have a Hollywood A-list actor there so that they could bring in audience members. And while I'm not sure necessarily if Denzel Washington is the strongest Shakespearean actor, he plays Don Pedro, I very much appreciated that an African-American actor was cast in the role, and it was a role that wasn't necessarily dictated by race or ethnicity. So I like the inclusivity of that. But at any rate, what you can obviously see is that we've got another comedy, which means that we're going to have our happy ending after mix-ups and misunderstandings and difficulties associated with love. This play, however, is going to be firmly set in reality. No fairies, no fantasies, nothing like that. Nothing like what we saw in Midsummer. And that's very illustrated by the kind of language that Shakespeare decided to use, in that the play is set in prose or in complete sentences, which sets it more in the world of reality rather than putting it in verse or in poetry, which oftentimes is considered to be a more higher level form of communication. Hero and Claudio very much represent young superficial love. They are the young couple that marries out of convenience, and they are in direct contrast to Benedict and Beatrice, who are older and have a more mature love, but they are afraid to be vulnerable, which is part of the impetus for the action of this particular drama. And without a doubt, Benedict and Beatrice are more interesting than Hero and Claudio. So it's not surprising that Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson, his wife at the time, played the roles of Benedict and Beatrice. Don John, if nothing else, admits that he's a plain dealing villain. And one of the things that we see in this play is that there is dishonesty and deception everywhere. And the great irony is that the one character who is not deceptive is the one who's creating the deception. And that's Don John. He admits that he's a plain dealing villain, and he acts that way. He's a literal and figurative bastard, and perhaps that's some motivation for some of the deeds in which he engages in. He's a figurative bastard in the sense that he's just an evil person or a plain dealing villain. He enjoys creating havoc and discord, and some individuals enjoy doing that, and that could be one of the motivations. And another motivation is that he is also a family bastard, so he's considered an outsider or the other in the family. There's nothing to show that he's been treated like an outsider. If anything else, it seems that Don Pedro has embraced him. However, this sense of being considered a bastard, it's a label that he carries throughout the entire play, could in fact, again, be motivation for some of his desires to enact havoc and perhaps even a certain level of revenge. The friar, as I had indicated last class, represents reason and rationality, and he will be important in terms of creating yet another deception, the deception that Hero is dead, and in fact, in some way she is. Her reputation has been killed in that wedding scene. And of course, she is resurrected. We know that we can't have any literal death in a comedy. So it turns out that Hero is alive and well, and her reputation will indeed be resurrected as well by the ending. And if nothing else, it shows the importance of virginity for female, which was alluded to in A Midsummer Night's Dream, but it's directly addressed in Much Ado About Nothing, where we've got a father who basically is wishing that his daughter were dead rather than to dishonor the family name. Now, we know that with Midsummer Night's Dream, the same thing somewhat occurred when Hermia was confronted with either a nunnery or death, and her father would be perfectly fine with both of those options, a nunnery being a life of virginity and chastity, or death being literal death. But here we definitely have a Leonardo who says, I wish I were dead, rather than having to confront the possibility that Hero has dishonored the family. Rumors and hearsay and deception run this play, as well as the importance of maintaining one's reputation. And that goes all the way down to Dogberry. Not only is he our, quote, comic relief, quote unquote, that would be very helpful to have in a comedy because it's supposed to be humorous. But he also is so concerned with his reputation. He's an incompetent constable, but all he wants is to be acknowledged as having a certain level of competence. And the irony is that despite his incompetence, he's the one who saves the day. He's the one who is able to provide him enough information to uncover the truth. One thing that I did want you to think about was that wedding scene, which is so brutal to read and perhaps even more brutal to watch, as we saw in the film version, that the only man standing by Hero outside of the friar is Benedict. So there is an element to Benedict, a certain an understanding that the other characters don't have, a certain level of empathy and a certain level of maturity. But that's not to say that he can't be made an idiot when it comes to love, and that's exactly what we're going to see. And we see this right at the very beginning. You can see in the notes below, I've indicated some important quotes and themes for us to consider. And the first one I wanted to draw your attention to is in Act 1. Act 1, Scene 1, line 124. And at this particular point, Benedict is basically saying that he's a ladies' man and he loves none. For truly, I love none. Now, the thing is Beatrice responds that I'd rather hear my dog bark at a crow than a man swear he loves me. So she doesn't want love either. And as they continue to maintain this and repeat this over and over again, it's very clear to everyone around them that this is just another facade or deception, that they very much do want love, but they are too afraid to risk being hurt. So they are putting on this persona of being independent. And Benedict continues in Act 1, Scene 1, line 238, when he says that he wants to be a bachelor. And then in Act 1, Scene 1, line 274, Don Pedro thinks Benedict will change his mind. In fact, we all think Benedict will change his mind because he doth protest too much. Each time he keeps talking about wanting to be a bachelor, we become more and more suspicious. And the same with Beatrice. And this is also in Act 1, Scene 1, line 296, that we get back to Claudio. Remember, he and Hero are supposed to be our main couple, even though probably it's Benedict and Beatrice who steal the show. And he talks about, Claudio that is, he talks about why it is that he wants Hero. And in many ways, it would be very typical of the expectations of the time in terms of courtship and marriage. That, as he says, when you went onward on this ended action, I looked upon her with a soldier's eye that liked, but had a rougher task in hand than to drive liking to the name of love. But now I am returned, and that war thoughts have left their place vacant. In their rooms come thronging soft and delicate desires, all prompting me how fair young Hero is, saying I liked her ere I went to wars. In other words, that this is a good time for Claudio in order to choose Hero, because if for no other reason, he's back from the war. And this starts the play that the men are returning back from war so that there's a great time of celebration. But might I suggest that they're entering into another war that's equally challenging. This is the war of love. And we can see how the men might be completely unprepared to enter this particular war of love. And as Claudio continues to talk about some of the reasons why he wants Hero, we see that it's very important to him when he talks to his friend Benedict that he gets approval as to why he should be able to choose Hero. And obviously Hero is young. Obviously Hero is attractive. Obviously Hero is available. As we've already established, this is the correct time. And also, Leonato has no other children. In other words, Hero will be the heir to Leonato's fortune. So there is a certain level of calculatedness to this. And again, I don't necessarily see that as something that would be that unusual during the time period about trying to find the proper match. And really, Hero and Claudio know very little about one another. They have very little dialogue with one another. One of the things that happens in terms of reinforcing this theme of deception and manipulation is that Don Pedro, who is of a higher status, is going to disguise himself as Claudio to try to woo Hero, almost like a Cyrano de Bergerac story, if you will. Of course, it leads to the possibility of additional misunderstandings because Claudio sees this and he thinks that Don Pedro is wooing for himself, of course, with a little bit of help from Don John, helping Claudio believe this. There's a little bit of foreshadowing about how gullible Claudio is because he will again assume that Hero is guilty of something that she is not guilty of by the time we get to the third act. So that leads us into the second act, which I think is important because not only does Beatrice say that in Act 2, Scene 1, line 19, that she wants no husband, but perhaps even more importantly, Act 2, Scene 1, line 239. And Benedict is talking about Beatrice, and he's saying, she told me, not thinking I'd been myself, that I was the princess jester, that I was duller than a great thaw, huddling jest upon jest with such impossible conveyance upon me, that I stood like a man at a mark, with a whole army shooting at me. She speaks poniards, and every word stabs. If her breath were as terrible as her terminations, there were no living near her. She would infect to the North Star. I would not marry her, though she were endowed with all that Adam had left him before he transgressed. Benedict says he won't marry Beatrice. No one said anything about Benedict marrying Beatrice. This has come out of nowhere, and I think it's quite telling that he's been thinking about marrying Beatrice, and his response is, I won't marry Beatrice. So obviously, there is some attraction between the two. In fact, Benedict and Beatrice seem like a couple that's much better suited for one another than Hero and Claudio. And the fact that Benedict and Beatrice not only are older and more mature, but they seem to have very similar temperaments. They are incredibly intelligent, and they are both masters of wit. And Shakespeare shows that you don't have to write poetry to show a great facility for language, because some of the most intelligent and witty Shakespeare dialogue appears in prose in Much Ado About Nothing. So we also find out in Act 2, Scene 2, line 33, Borachio and Don John want to stain Hero's honor. Borachio, by the way, is Spanish for drunk, which I think works very nicely, and Shakespeare will oftentimes employ drunks to reveal the truth and also to show how we can become drunk when our emotions are out of control. And that's definitely something that we will see over the course of this semester. Now, Benedict in Act 2, Scene 3, line 6 talks about that he wants all graces in a woman. In other words, he wants perfection. And once he finds that perfection, then ultimately he can settle down. Of course, it's an impossibility to find all graces in a woman. So this is his way, again, of protecting himself. But what he says is, I am well, yet I am well. Another virtuous, yet I am well. But till all graces be in one woman shall not come in my grace. Rich she shall be, that's certain. Wise, or I'll none. Virtuous, or I'll never cheapen her. Fair, or I'll never look on her. Mild, or come not near me. Noble, or not I for an angel. Of good discourse, an excellent musician, and her hair, well, shall be whatever color it shall be, whatever it please God. In other words, she has to be perfect except for her hair color. He'll accept anything. Of course, this is absolutely ludicrous, what he's saying. And we find that out when they are both so easily convinced to love one another that they have been protesting too much. Leonardo, before this, in Act 2, Scene 3, line 136, he finds the words Benedict and Beatrice written on a piece of paper. He's speaking with Claudio. And Leonardo says, oh, when she had read it and was reading it over, she found Benedict and Beatrice between the sheet. This almost reminds me of a junior high school couple that is writing their names on a desk, or, indicating that they hate one another when in reality they really love one another because they're just unable to express their affection for one another, or they don't know how to express their affection for one another. And in Act 2, Scene 3, line 220, Benedict is easily convinced to love Beatrice. Well, if she loves him, well, then, of course, he must love her in return. And perhaps one of my favorite lines is his justification, and that, after all, the world must be peopled. That, in other words, it is his duty to keep humanity going generation after generation. Therefore, he must be with Beatrice and make more children. And the importance of maintaining his reputation, the idea that he is a strong, independent person and that he's only going to love Beatrice, well, because he wants to put her out of her pain of loving him. And of course, he has a duty to continue the species. The same can be said of Beatrice, that Beatrice is so easily convinced to love Benedict because she wants to love Benedict, because she does love Benedict. And of course, what we've got here are the friends, and this play very much divides itself up into the men and the women, trying to convince the individual that it's time for them to admit their true feelings. But as easy as it is for both Benedict and Beatrice to love one another, it's that easy for Claudio to believe in Hero's infidelity. A lot of that has to be because of Don John's competence as a villain, but also part of that happens to do because of Claudio's gullibility. And we see how at the beginning of the play, he was easily manipulated into thinking that Don Pedro was wooing for himself during the masquerade ball. And again, the masquerade being such a great symbol of the facades and the masks that we all wear to try to hide our true selves. And then Dogberry says in Act 3, Scene 3, line 78, he incompetently believes that a watch should offend no one. Of course, a watch has to offend someone. That's the whole point of a watch, is that they're going to be protecting. You know that Shakespeare will take an opportunity to make a sexual reference, if at all possible. And one of those appears in Act 3, Scene 4, line 60. And what we get are some pieces of dialogue where the women are speaking by themselves. And when the women are speaking by themselves, they're much more bawdy and they're much more honest than when they are in public or when they are in mixed company. And this is Margaret, and she's speaking about being stuffed. And stuffed in Act 3, Scene 4, line 60, can have more than one meaning. So Hero and Margaret are speaking with one another. And it begins with Hero saying, God give me joy to wear, for my heart is exceedingly heavy. Yeah, they were talking about a nightgown. And then the response is by Margaret, "'Twill be heavier soon by the weight of a man." In other words, that during sexual relations, that she will experience weight on top of her chest. And Hero says, Fie upon thee. Art not ashamed? How could you say something like that? Are you ashamed? And Margaret says, of what, lady? Of speaking honorably? Is not marriage honorable as a beggar? And this is in Act 3, Scene 4, around line 25 or so. Is not your Lord honorable without marriage? I think you would have me say, saving your reference a husband. And bad thinking do not rest true speaking. I'll offend nobody. Is there any harm in the heavier for a husband? None, I think. And if she be the right husband and the right wife, otherwise 'tis light and not heavy. And then the reference to being stuffed occurs when Beatrice joins the conversation. And this is in Act 3, Scene 4, around line 60 or so. And Margaret says, or actually Hero is the one that says, these gloves the Count have sent me. They are an excellent perfume. And Beatrice says, I'm stuffed, cousin, I cannot smell. In other words, I have a cold. I can't smell that. And Margaret says, a maid and stuffed? The idea that you could be a virgin and yet you are still stuffed. Again, another sexual reference. So Margaret is quite bawdy, and we can see that the girl talk, if you will, between them is rather honest in a way that we don't necessarily see dialogue, particularly for female, when female is in public, that it can be just as bawdy as the male dialogue as well. Not too surprising, too, that Shakespeare would make references to clothes and fashion in terms of facades. It was something that was alluded to in reference to makeup as well when we were talking about the sonnets. So as we continue on, the height of conflict, as we know, is supposed to be in Act 3, but it probably spills to Act 4 as well, when ultimately Claudio publicly rejects Hero. Act 4, Scene 1, line 29. That it's not enough for Claudio to not marry Hero, but he wants revenge. He wants retribution. He wants to completely destroy her reputation, and that's exactly what he does. And then in Act 4, Scene 1, line 113, Don Pedro, Don John, and Claudio all abandon Hero. Again, only Benedict is the one who's willing to stand by Hero and basically say, stop. There's something going on here. There's something not right. And even her own father, Leonato, rejects her. And Act 4, Scene 1, line 119. And then we get the friar, the voice of reason, and his plan to fake Hero's death because we value that what we no longer have, which is a truth about humanity that I think is timeless and universal. And this is our lesson among many lessons for audience. Now, when we get to Act 5, we know that ultimately we have to have some resolution. And we know that there's going to be resolution to Hero and Claudio. Dogberry, of all people, helps to bring about the truth to Claudio. But notice that it's only after it's been proven that Hero is innocent that Claudio feels regret and forgives Hero. And of course, you might say it's not Claudio that has to forgive Hero. It's Hero that has to forgive Claudio. Again, if you think about the time period of the play, perhaps that can help explain why Hero so easily accepts Claudio back, despite the fact that he has treated her so unjustly. And this is where we see in Act 5 as well an incredible amount of wit in some of the dialogue. Act 5, Scene 1, line 50. And in fact, there are plenty of places where we are going to see witty dialogue. But I just wanted to use this as an example. Act 5, Scene 1, line 50. And this is where we get Beatrice speaking. And I'm thinking, oh, here we go. I'm sorry, it's not line 50, it's line 150. And this is where Don Pedro is actually speaking. And Don Pedro is saying in Act 5, Scene 1, approximately line 155 or so. I'll tell thee how Beatrice praised thy wit the other day. I said thou hadst a fine wit. True, said she, a fine little one. No, said I, a great wit. Right, said she, a great gross one. Nay, said I, a good wit. Just, said she, it hurts nobody. Nay, said I, the gentleman is wise. Certain, said she, a wise gentleman. Nay, said I, he hath the tongues. That I believe, said she, For he swore a thing to me on Monday night, which he forswore on Tuesday morning. There's a double tongue. There's two tongues. Thus did she and our together transhape thy particular virtues. Yet at last she concluded with a sigh, thou wast the prosperous man in Italy. Just to give you an idea about some of the language. And we also see how Benedict is reduced to being almost inarticulate when it comes to love, as he's trying to write a poem in Act 5, Scene 2, line 36 or so, and he's unable to. He only comes up with basic rhymes, and he laments the fact that he can only come up with basic rhymes. And he says, Mary, I cannot show it in rhyme. I've tried. I can find no rhyme to lady but baby, an innocent rhyme. For scorn, horn, a hard rhyme. For school, fool, a babbling rhyme. Very ominous endings. No, I was not born under a rhyming planet, nor I cannot woo in festival terms. So when we find out at the end that Beatrice is able to manipulate, and I use that word very deliberately, manipulate Benedict into committing murder for her in order to prove how much he loves her, that Benedict will basically kill Claudio to protect Hero's virtue. I think we get the sense that Beatrice has the upper hand in terms of their particular relationship. And while they can both be considered to be rather idiotic when it comes to love, and while they both have witty language, I would say that Beatrice's language is a bit wittier, and the example that I just gave is an example of that. And also the fact that she is able to convince Benedict to do something he doesn't want to do rather than the other way around shows a certain level of strength for female, particularly for Benedict. Where we're told in Act 5, Scene 4, line 70, that wonder seems familiar. And of course, that's exactly part of what we see in the comedies, that what it seems wondrous, it becomes familiar. And while we have Hero and Claudio, while Claudio is going to marry Hero's cousin, who of course ends up being the heir of the family, so there's a certain incentive for him to marry her. But he's never met this woman, and the idea is that she's supposed to be Hero's double, so that this is his way of showing retribution that to Leonato, is that he's willing to basically marry or do anything Leonato asks without question, because he's obviously been so misled in the past. And then we get the big reveal that basically it isn't Hero's cousin, it's Hero herself. And ultimately she is reborn, her reputation has been revived. But what we're really concerned with is less about Hero and Claudio and more about Benedict and Beatrice. And they have to publicly admit their love for one another, almost against their wills. And they actually have to show letters that they've written to one another, another piece of physical proof, which we see in Act 5, Scene 4, line 52. And this is where they're shown that, well, it's almost as if they were writing against their will. And Claudio says, I'll be sworn upon it that he loves her, for here's a paper written in his hand, a halting sonnet of his own pure brain, fashioned to Beatrice. And then Hero says, and here's another, written in my cousin's hand, stolen from her pocket, containing her affection unto Benedict. And then Benedict's response is, a miracle. Here's our own hands against our hearts. And, of course, at this particular point, Benedict says perhaps the moral of the play. Man is but a giddy thing. And this is my conclusion. In other words, that this was all much ado about nothing. The war of words and wit and love and prose in this play. Please note that Don John is punished after the events of the play. The idea is that in order to have a happy ending, that we should focus on the love relationships rather than focusing on the justice against evil. As we're told by the messenger at the ending of the play, my lord, your brother John has taken flight and brought with armed men back to Messina. And Benedict's response is, think not on him until tomorrow. Devise thee brave punishments for him. Strike up the pipers. And again, we know that comedies have a good amount of music and dance to them, so this is going to be the celebration. And I thought that the film, the Branagh version, did a very nice job of showing some great, beautiful shots of Italy. They were able to film on location, one of the things that you can't necessarily do with a stage play, and just some beautiful dancing and celebration at the ending of the play. So I'm not necessarily done talking about Much Ado About Nothing, but I hope this gave you at least a little bit of an overview of some of the important pieces of the play. And I know that I still haven't gotten to quoting for papers as well. So I thought that what I could do is put some closure onto Much Ado About Nothing next class. And then we could also talk a little bit about some of the conventions for quoting Shakespearean dialogue. And then finally, we can move on to our next play, which is going to be shifting from the comedies to the histories. So the play is Richard II, and we'll talk a little bit about history plays and their significance and why we're reading Richard II. And once again, we will watch another production as well, and I'll talk a little bit about why I chose the particular production I did of Richard II. So I hope you're doing well. I am doing well. We'll put closure onto Much Ado About Nothing next class. Take care. Bye-bye.